Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eddie Paul. I'm the Senior Director of Library and Learning Services at the Jewish Public Library. From what little I know of Leah, she would have given short shrift to a long introduction, and I want to respect that, but she likely would have approved of a territorial land acknowledgement with which we now prefix our events. The Jewish Public Library is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanyen'kehá:ka people. This land was also a diplomatic gathering place for other Iroquoians and Algonquins. It has been the site of exchange, creativity, and storytelling for thousands of years. We are grateful to be able to cultivate dialogue, imagination, and lifelong learning here. Before I introduce Ariela and Shannon, however, I'd like to thank and acknowledge a few people for making this event possible and for their support. Early this year, the JPL was provided with funding support from the Israeli Foundation for the next 3 years, which, amongst other things, has allowed us to fully staff the JPL archives for the first time in its history, and which has also given us the opportunity to ramp up our education outreach programs. Lea Roback Through the Looking Glass is the second of these programs, which casts a light upon the archives. The first was a program I ran last month, featuring Jason Lustig's book, A Time Together, Archives in the Control of Jewish Culture. And it's by no means going to end here. We're already planning a number of other events for the fall that will pull many Jewish archives across Canada together. And I just encourage you to keep an eye out for these programs on our website as they get publicized. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence this afternoon of members of the Roback family and the Léa Roback Foundation, whose work has kept the life and legacy of Leah alive and thriving, as well as the support of Rivka Augenfeld, whose profound and dedicated involvement in the JPL began in 1948 and continues unabated. Initially, this was going to be a standard Zoom meeting format where we, the panelists, would see you and you would see us, but registration maxed out at over 250 people. And to manage this event effectively, I transitioned it to a webinar format, which means you can see us, but we can't see you. I don't, however, want to dissuade you from asking questions or participating, and you'll be free to ask questions or comment at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And if you'd like to ask questions directly, please just indicate this and we'll unmute you during the Q&A at the end of the event. It's my pleasure to introduce Ariela Freedman and Shannon Hodge to you. I'll give a more detailed introduction for Shannon following Ariela's talk. But in the interim, Ariela is a professor at the Liberal Arts College at Concordia University. She was born in Brooklyn, earned her bachelor's degree at Concordia, returned to New York to earn her PhD at NYU. Her 2014 book, Death, Men, and Modernism, Trauma and Narrative in British Fiction from Hardy to Wolfe, was followed by 2 novels, Arabic for Beginners in 2017, and A Joy to be Hidden in 2019, both published by Linda Leith Publishing, as is her current book, Leah, a work obviously of biographical fiction, a genre which comes with its own set of challenges around narrative voice, character development, and of course, poetic license in noodling around with history. Not that you were noodling, it was very, very good noodling as far as I was concerned. This is why we thought it would be an exceptionally cool idea to organize an event that features a novel and documents and photos from the Lea Roback collection and sound files, I think, that are all held here in the JPL archives, which will be part 2 of this session. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Ariela Freedman.
Thank you so much for coming. I think the interest in this talk and the attendance is a testament to the extraordinary impact that Lea Roback has had and still has. And I'm really grateful that my book can contribute in some small way to the continuance of that legacy. It's especially meaningful to have people from the family and people from the foundation here. There are so many people who are carrying her work forward. So in some small way, I'm really glad to be a part of that. When I first learned about Lea Roback, I'm going to open my PowerPoint. She was new to me. It was the first time that I'd learned about her. And I felt a little cheated that I wasn't lucky enough to know her. I decided to learn more about her, and the archive at the Jewish Public Library became an intimate way of tracing her life. So the chatty and affectionate enthusiasm of her letters, the topical savvy and breadth of her news clippings, the wide range of her political commitments in the posters and pamphlets which she had organized and attended. I thought somebody should really write a book about this woman. Somebody should really write a book about her. So as I learned more, the learning turned into writing, and the writing turned into this novel. I've been thinking about the idea of fetal microchimerism, which is this relatively new kind of scientific understanding that when a mother carries a child, the fetal cells migrate into the mother and can stay there sometimes for decades. So I felt like researching and carrying this book, I wanted to infuse myself with a little bit of Lea's intrepid spirit. There are foundations and research centers and family members who carry on Lea's spirit and her legacy. I wanted to mention some of the books and films that I used when I was writing this book, because many, many people have contributed to the historical project of her memory. So Sophie Bissonnette's incredible film, A Vision in Darkness, which was just extraordinary. Merrilee Weisbord's The Strangest Dream, which is getting re-released this year, about the history of Canadian communists in Montreal, and William Weintraub's book City Unique, about Montreal in the 40s and 50s. All of that was really formative and helpful for me. So were Melanie Levitt's walking tours. So Melanie Levitt is a relative of Lea Roback, and she does tremendous walking tours of the garment district in Montreal, very much in Lea's spirit. I highly recommend them if you haven't gone on them before. I didn't know what kind of project I wanted to pursue when I came to the archives in the fall of 2018. Jessica Vernay was the archivist at the time, and when she brought out the boxes in the collection, I was pretty overwhelmed. I've worked in archives before, but briefly. I'm not a historian. I'm a literature scholar and a novelist. This is a pretty raw archive in some ways. There's no comprehensive finding key. There are multiple copies of the same documents. Stuff is sometimes filed in the wrong place. Lea was an archivist too. She collected articles and materials, and sometimes their relevance was clear and sometimes it wasn't. For all that the archive was overwhelming, it was pretty thrilling, and the haphazardness was part of the thrill. So finding a shopping list or medical appointments or a twined lock of brown and golden hair, those were pretty exciting things in the archive. Lea was a family historian. I think that it was her job to remember her family, and among the treasures of the collection are her annotations to the family albums. She was also a writer. She started to write her story a few times. Mostly she concentrated on the formative period, which I write about as well, when she traveled to Berlin and then returned to Montreal to play a formative role in the labor movement and the suffrage movement. She never got very far in these notes, and her writing was sometimes sketchy, as if she planned to fill in the project later on. She was a great talker, warm, charming, entertaining. I listened to a lot of oral material and read some oral material. So Nicole Lascelles' Entretien avec Madeleine Parent et Lea Roback, and digitized tapes with Ira and Harris. All of that gave me some sense of her voice. She wrote scripts about working women for radio, and she edited them in ways that sometimes slightly distorted the original transcripts. And that was pretty heartening for me, because it was as if she'd given me permission to slightly edit the story of her life as I tried to tell it myself, because a story is not the same thing as a life. And as we tell the stories of our lives, we're always revising, editing, imagining beginnings and endings and arcs and ends. I had no idea how to tell a story out of this big and busy life. Each box was a portal into different possibilities. I could have researched forever. At some point, I needed to dive in. I had published 2 novels already. They were pretty different than this one. more contemporary, first person, autofictional in tone. Suddenly I felt really urgently called to history. It's something to do with the 2016 election in the United States and the Charlottesville riots in 2017. Do you know that Goya print, The Sleep of Reason, produces monsters? It was as if all of these historical monsters were coming back, and that was before the pandemic. What if history is a boomerang and not an arrow, Ralph Ellison suggests? What if that boomerang hit you on the head? Like a lot of people, when I started writing this book, I felt pretty blindsided by history. I wanted to deepen my own historic sense and to imagine someone who lived through darker times than mine and with a sense of hope and urgency. There should be a full biography of Lea. I hope somebody's writing one. I hope it covers all the years of her life, because one of the most extraordinary things about her is that she persisted into her 97th year and was an activist almost all the way through, marching into her 80s with her white hair and her bright blue beret. Why did I write a novel and not a biography? I think a biographer has to maintain a certain decorum and distance in relation to their subject. They're on the outside. The novel, I think, is the form par excellence of interiority. It doesn't tell us facts or chronology, but how it felt to be there. Lauren Groff's a writer whose most recent book is historical fiction, and she says, you take the wisdom of your body and you filter history through it. I didn't know what it was like to be in Berlin in 1931, but I knew what it was like to be at a march. I knew it was like to be afraid. I knew it was like to be in love. The choice of fiction also let me fill in some parts that were obscure. Some things are really easy to get right. There's excellent records on the weather all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. It's easy to be correct about the date of the Stalin-Hitler Pact, which I triple checked anyway in order to be certain. But writing fiction means that you can address some of the things that are really tricky, like how it feels to have your political idols at war with your own people, and whether or not Lea Roback was ever really in love. Novalis says, in a quote that's an epigraph to one of my favorite historical novels, Wolf Hall, that novels arise out of the shortcomings of history. They fill in the gaps, they provide lived texture, they enlarge the imagination. I wrote a novel because I love what novels can do, but I will gladly, avidly read the biography that somebody should be writing. And it's possible that if that biography had existed, I wouldn't have actually written that book. I used bits and pieces from Roback's interviews and writing in my book. My mother-in-law used to have two odd special possessions. She had a tiny toy Alexander Calder sculpture, and she had a dove, and she used to let the dove just fly around her house. And what the dove would do is steal the top of the Calder sculpture and nest with it on top of the bookcase. And my mother-in-law would go and take this like priceless piece of art out of the nest, and she'd put it back on the sculpture, and she'd do it again and again and again. I think writers are a little like that. I think they're looking for shiny things to put inside the nests that they're building. They're architects and thieves. Mary McCarthy says that writing a novel is putting real plums in an imaginary cake. And so I was looking for the plums that I could use in that cake. I thought I would end my section by talking about one of those plums, a place where I worked pretty closely with some of Lea's writing. And this is unusual because I'm closer in this moment to her text than I was often in the novel, just because this kind of writing wasn't usually available. But for me, this was a particularly revelatory moment in the book. So I'll read this out because it's a little bit hard to read it. And then I'll read you my version. It's about the end of her time in Berlin. In 1932, I went to see one of my profs to ask if I should pack up and go home to Canada. He too was a Jew, a German Jew. He looked at me and with great astonishment said, "Frau Roback, what's the problem?" I told him the Nazi harassment of Jews and workers and intellectuals is a great source of worry. He laughed and said, "We're not like the Italians with their clown Mussolini. Hitler may try to take over the government, but it won't last. He might be in the saddle for 3 months, but the Germans are intelligent. If they try any shenanigans, we'll oust him." I went to see the leader of my group, a capable man so knowledgeable. He and his wife advised me to go home as fast as possible. There will be war, Leah. Krupp Simons are working on more materials. Concentration camps are being built in different parts of the country. You're not German. Go back home and build a better land for the working people. I went back to Mr. Levy, my prof, and told him I was well informed and I was leaving Germany. I said that he, being Jewish, should take himself and his family to Switzerland, as a number of my private students were doing. I asked him to sign my certificate of studies. He called me a calamity Jane. He was furious and refused to sign it. Did he get away? Sorry if this has been a lengthy report, but it was what changed my outlook on life. Instead of teaching Goethe, Schiller, Heine, I decided I wanted to be able to further my understanding and knowledge of society and economic questions and problems and use it positively. So that's Lea's version. And here's my version in the novel. In the July elections, Hitler's party won 1/3 of the votes, more than any other party. She remembers the frog in Werner's parable, when will it be too late to jump? She goes to see Professor Levy. His office is lined with German classics. Heine, Schiller, Goethe, Hölderlin, Mann. He has lithographs of their faces on the wall, and on his desk is a photograph of his family, which she picks up and admires. She's brought a transcript, which he needs to sign so she can transfer her credits back home. Frau Roback, he says in great astonishment, what is the problem? He listens to her concerns about the worsening violence, the man she saw attacked, the bullies in their brown shirts, the sense that they are all of them on the precipice of a great disaster. He leans back in his chair, just a hint of a smile under his curled mustache. There is absolutely no need to be hysterical, he says, cutting her off before she can finish. It is Germany. We are not like the Italians with that joke Mussolini. Look at all this, he says, gesturing at the books on his walls. Maybe Hitler will get elected for a term, but he'll be out in 3 months. If he tries any of his shenanigans, we'll never let him get away with it. The Germans are too intelligent for that. Why? We invented culture. From his portrait on the wall, Goethe looks down on them with his characteristic expression of perpetual alarm. I think perhaps you've misjudged the situation, she says carefully. They are already letting him get away with it. So there's the plum and there's the imaginary cake. Jacques Derrida has an essay on archives, and he says that the question of archives is not just a question of the past, it's a question of the future itself, of a response and a responsibility for tomorrow. The uncanny effect of writing this book is that as I continued, Lea's concerns felt more and more contemporary. As I revised the book and I retreated into lockdown, I realized that she'd also lived through a pandemic. And the Spanish flu started to appear in my pages in tandem with the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last few months, the war in Ukraine and the leaked Supreme Court documents on Roe v. Wade have made me realize that the battles Lea fought were not won for once and for all, because nothing's won for once and for all. These are despairing times. But Lea did not despair. Her concerns feel ever more timely, and her resilience feels to me ever more significant. And I'll close with one last quote from the novel before I hand it over to Shannon. This is about when Stalin has joined with Hitler and Lea has this crisis of conscience about being a member of the Communist Party. Those weeks and then months are the worst, even more difficult than when her father died. She feels like she's fighting a double war, first against Hitler and then against imperial capitalism. And each battle, she is also her own enemy. She's noticed that when her friends in the movement talk about the Jewish situation in Europe, they're dismissed She has watched that active repression create a dead silence, and it puts a cold splinter in her heart. But she is not built for despair. She takes her doubts and fears and puts them in a box at the very back of her head. As is her habit, she drowns her worries with activity. There is more to do right here in Montreal. Thanks so much for your attention. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Ariela. I had a few questions, but I think I'll hold on to those until the very end. I'm proud to call Shannon a friend, if for no other reason than her commitment to archives and historiography transcend the large salary these two disciplines engender. I like to think that her position as the JPL's first full-time archivist was out of a sense of commitment to the mediation of memory, not just the muffins I used to bake for her, than the salary. She holds a BA in history from Bishops and a Master's of Library and Information Studies from McGill. In 2005, as I mentioned, she became the JPL's first full-time director of archives. And this lasted for 13 years. And for some reason, I can't remember now, I was assigned as her supervisor. And it became evident very quickly that her expertise, judgment, and knowledge rendered this entirely moot. Within a few short years, Shannon pulled 7 Jewish archival repositories together to form the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network, a collective catalog of archival holdings, developed the JPL's first educational outreach program called Medor Lador, from generation to generation, which brings archival documents, photos, and artifacts into secondary schools and synagogues to teach young people the importance of primary source documents, and which has become a model for my own rare book workshop program that I developed in 2014. And she essentially organized the JPL archives into a space that researchers from all over the world have used much more efficiently than it ever was before. In 2018, Shannon sat down with us and had the "It's Not You, It's Me" talk and moved to Ottawa to become the corporate archivist at Carleton University. Sure, it wasn't because the muffins are better in Ottawa. I'm very grateful that despite this tragic breakup, Shannon and I have remained very good friends, and it was by virtue of this friendship and the promise of muffins that I was able to convince her into being a part of this afternoon's event. Please join me in welcoming Shannon Hodge.
Thank you. No, the muffins in Ottawa are not better, nor are the bagels. We'll just put that out there right now. So let me just get myself established here. So I'm actually really grateful that Ariela started her talk the way she did, talking about the boomerang of history and what that means, and then also finishing up with how Lea's work isn't done and how these elements of history that we may look at as the past haven't really gone anywhere. Because I asked Eddie to begin with if it would be okay if I started my talk not with Lea, but actually the JPL. First, because I know that there's some people in the audience who've never been to the Jewish Public Library before or don't know its history. And also, during my time at the library, what was really very quickly apparent in working with the different collections, whether they were of an institution or an individual, is that you can't separate them from the world in which they were created, obviously. The context doesn't belong just to the individual or the institution, it belongs to the community or the communities in which they are operating as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to start way back in 1914. The Jewish Public Library, or the Yiddish Volksbibliothek, was founded in 1914, opening in a cold water flat at 669 Rue Saint-Urbain, with just a collection of 500 books. The library developed from the reading rooms of several different community organizations, such as the Polit Zion, the Parent Hirsch Institute, and various synagogues around the city. The library was led by community leaders such as Ruben Breinen, who's pictured here with Shalom Alechem and Heidi Berkovich, as well as Yehuda Kaufman, who was a scholar and journalist. But in addition to joining these two leaders, as well as others, was a legion of community volunteers, social organizations, institutions, and businesses that loaned their support to the library. And one of the very early taglines used in the library's brochures is that it was a library for the people, by the people, which I think that Lea eventually probably would have been very supportive of, if not for the reference to the US, not for that, but just that this really truly was a folk bibliothèque. In the early years, and indeed in certain decades, the library was marked by financial struggle. The library's own archives detail trouble paying coal bills in the beginning years, but also during the Depression. But the struggle to establish and nourish a successful library was vital to so many, despite differences in language, ideology, politics, and religious beliefs amongst the different members and leaders of the library. During the library centenary, a grown-up child, obviously, but a child of one of the early board members told us that after board meetings where there would be debates and discourse about which pamphlets or periodicals or which people or which writers to invite to speak at the library, those debates would spill into Fletcher's Field immediately across from the library. And that story has stayed with me for so long, because I just think it's so wonderful to think of, like, this is what the library was about. The early years were marked and continue to be marked with this idea that debate and discourse are such an important part of the community, and that runs through so many of the individuals and institutions that are represented in the library's archives itself. Also, I really like that story because I like to think of, the poor English or French police officer that shows up in Fletcher's Field to a bunch of people speaking Yiddish and yelling at each other very loudly, only to find out, much to this person's confusion, that it's over a book or a writer who's been invited to speak without obviously understanding the underlying politics behind it, perhaps. So it's this passion that drives the library forward. Cultural, political, and literary debate were the heart of the early days of the Yiddish folk bibliothèque. Fundraising efforts to support the library were constant in the Jewish community. I don't think that's changed, obviously, for many institutions in the community. And it was a community that was made up of, at that point, largely Yiddish-speaking working class immigrants making their homes along the Main or the St. Laurent Boulevard. And the library wasn't simply a place for books for these people. It was a gathering place for literary and cultural exchange. It was a home in a new country where ideals of Europe's Jewish Enlightenment and Yiddish language and culture could plant new roots and flourish. So eventually, out of the initial reading room and collections of books, newspapers, and periodicals, and early members of the library came the library's archives. The JPL Archives is a collection of stories and storytellers, the memories of hundreds of community members documented in text, photographic, and audiovisual records, and preserving the papers of the city's Yiddish literary figures, many of whom were active leaders and participants in the Jewish Public Library, was probably more a natural progression into the library's role as a caretaker of cultural history and heritage in Jewish Montreal. The JPL Archives' earliest collection preserves the personal archives of poets, journalists, artists, figure skaters, and academics. And from these early literary collections, the JPL quickly grew to include the earliest Jewish day schools in Montreal, the synagogues, labor, fraternal, and social organizations such as the Arbeiter's Ring or Workmen's Circle, Montefiore Club, the Jewish Junior Welfare League, the Young Men, Young Women's Hebrew Association, and more. So into this JPL Archives comes Lea Roback's collection. Lea Roback's archives fall into the category of personal archives within the JPL Archives repository. A diverse group of rich archives of individuals dating from the mid-19th century to today. In addition to literary figures, and the personal archives within the JPL covers leaders in labor activism, so obviously people like Lea, architecture, filmmaking, music theater, art education, sports, business, and philanthropy, not to mention the personal archives that belong to families and their own domestic lives. These personal archives are the anchors for the legacy of communities that founded the library back in 1914, along with so many other Jewish Montreal community institutions of that period. It's impossible to review the histories of Montreal Jewish community institutions without looking at the work and lives of the individuals of the communities and vice versa. The JPL's archival collections of both institutions and the individual are tightly woven together. Not to hammer too much on the woven metaphor, but they are the fabric in which they work, thoughts, prayers, and dreams of the individual weave into the diverse communities' imagined borders and historical and present day institutions. And this was the world in which Lea Roback would eventually move into. The contributions to Quebec and Canada's labor history by the Jewish communities in Montreal and elsewhere in Canada can't be understated. Many leftist activists and writers are part of not just the JPL's history, but dozens of other Jewish Montreal institutions founded in the early 20th century. Archivists, our training and our archival processes can often emphasize the need to define what a record is. And it's based on the transactionality of said record. Why was it created? What was its function? What evidence does it provide? And even breaking down that word evidence often restricts a researcher or an archivist to the confines of Western colonial legal parameters of what evidence is. These parameters of the archival record are in large part due to our archival training and the way in which we organize records based on theory and training of the corporate or the institutional archive and their use. The personal archives, though, like Lea's archive, inspire researchers to go beyond mere transactionality of the record in front of them. As archivist Carleton Hodge stated, the personal fond of an individual is a site where personality and the events of a life interact in documentary form. Personal archives in the JPL, such as Lea's, beyond evidence, they push the discovery of societal, whether that's fringe or mainstream, norms of a specific era, culture, communities. It isn't strictly the history of the personal, but the psychology of their actions, beliefs, and impact on the world around them. And here is where we find Lea's archives. So I know that there are a lot of friends and family of Lea in the audience today, so I'm looking forward to any comments they have afterwards. But what I'm trying to do right now is give some pieces of Lea's archival collection in the same way that Ariela did, but do so in an overview of her life, especially for those people who may be in the audience who aren't really familiar with Lea herself. So the Lea Roback, the actual collection itself consists of 4.8 linear meters of textual records. So when Ariela talks about walking in and having these boxes delivered to her, it is overwhelming. There is a lot. And to this day, I think, I haven't been there for 4 years, but I do believe that Lea's collection still remains one of the larger personal archives within the institution. It includes hundreds of letters between family and friends, published works and periodicals she collected, personal work documents, photographs, objects, and sound recordings. Brought into the JPL archives by Archivist Emeritus Iron Harris, Lea's phone, as I said, remains one of the largest, but her phone was truly a collection of titles that can be used for the woman herself as it's a reflection of her, right? So it's eclectic, it's detailed, it's passionate, spans eras and issues. It's anchored in hard work and familial devotion. I find it hard to break down her archive into neat summaries, as I think Ariela found as well, because it's really a prime example of the personal is political. This was Lea, right? The personal is political. The records of her work and her relationships are not mutually exclusive to one another. Everything is woven together between family and activism and her work. So it's a beautiful collection, and I do miss it. I do miss just being able to walk down an aisle and pop open a box and look in to see what was going on with Lea's life at any given point in time. So Lea was born on November 3rd, 1903 on Guibault Street in Montreal to Fanny and Moses, Jewish immigrants from Poland. She was the second of 9 children in an observant Jewish family. The Robacks moved to Beauport, just outside of Quebec City, while Lea was still quite young and remained there operating a general store for many, many years. Within her archival phone, you'll find several albums of hundreds of family photographs, as Ariela already mentioned. This image of Lea and her siblings is actually described in Ariela's novel, which is why I wanted to use it. It shows 5 of the 9 Roback family, and the caption reads, "Annie is daydreaming in the cushion. Lea with curls is holding to the lace on Annie's dress. Rose refused to be photographed unless Mama gave her a ring to play with. Harry, always the responsible one, makes sure that Lottie will not slide off the bench, and he holds her arm." So again, these albums that Lea preserved, yes, she was her own archivist. She was her family's archivist, and all of them, every single page has at least one caption that captures what was going on in the family at the time. And outside of the family too, these are images of Beauport. They were the only Jewish family in a Catholic, French Catholic village, isolated, very isolated. So the captions reflect what it was like to be in that moment, and then moving to Montreal and working at His Majesty's Theatre and so on. So these are just, she's writing these not just for her family, but this is for the larger society around her as well. They do read like a journal. So this is another selection of photographs from some of the albums. Winter in the Woods in Beauport, 1918. In addition to the family albums, Lea's phone preserves hundreds of letters between Lea's contemporaries, work colleagues, and of course her family. The letters are written in English, French, Yiddish, I think German as well. The letters between family members are enormous and span all of Lea's life. Letters to her mother, Fanny, are mostly in Yiddish and take up a large portion of the family's letters. When Lea was in her early teens, the entire family returned to Montreal, and eventually, like countless other girls from Jewish immigrant and working class French, Lea eventually began work, first as a dyer in the British American Dye Works Company, and then in 1922 as a cashier in Montreal's His Majesty's Theatre. Her experiences in Montreal's language manufacturing sector cemented her dedication for labor rights and activism. And this is the family as a whole here. In 1925, Lea left Montreal to study at the Université de Grenoble, working as an English tutor to help pay her way. After 2 years, she returned to North America, working in New York until 1929, at which point she joined her brother Henry, who was studying in Germany. Enrolled in university and once again tutoring English, Lea began attending lectures and student demonstrations organized by leftist political groups and unions. That same year, she joined the Communist Party, and she remained in Germany until 1932, as Ariela described, at which point she was encouraged to leave due to the rise of fascism. Lea's archival collection contains lengthy oral history interviews, some of which is also located at the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives as well. And I just wanted to say hello to Janice, because I know she's here from the archives. And also just to say that she was a partner in crime for the establishment of the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network. So I just wanted to make that clear as well. Lea's oral history interviews in her archives detail this time specifically. So I'm going to play a clip here from an interview that she did with Iron Harris in 1996. Maybe Eddie, you can just give me a thumbs up to let me know that everybody can hear it once I press play. Okay.
Had I said, ich bin Kanadierin, aber ich bin auch Jüdin, that would have get the hell out fast. So I just said, ich bin Kanadierin. Ach so, wie schön. And they wanted to know all about Canada and about how the French and the English got along. And I said, very well. Each one has a right to their schools and language. And I said, there's intermarriage as well. Ach so. And they didn't ask me about Juden, and I didn't.
But they didn't expect something from you, let us say, to further their cause. He was a Canadian who could possibly be helpful.
No, I didn't mix in their politics. I told them I came here to study the language, the history. I said, that's why I came here. Ach, wie schön. Wirklich, Fräulein Roback. And it was. So I came here, not as a French Canadian, English Canadian, Jewish. I came here as a Canadian. Sie ist Kanadierin. And had I said I was Jewish, then, of course, I had said, ich bin eine Kanadierin, aber ich bin eine Jüdin. No, it would have been grässlich. So I just said, ich bin Kanadierin, and ça marche.
They didn't try to...
I love that the last line of that is ça marche. Sorry, 1 second, did I go too far? Here we go. After her return to Montreal, Lea worked for the Young Women's Hebrew Association, programming for the young women of that organization. She organized educational offerings from improving English and French skills, providing information on schooling, and helping girls apply for jobs. Amongst those educational offerings, she also managed to insert information for the girls on sexual and reproductive health, a goal which also inserted into union organizing in the garment factories for Lea. Her upbringing, language skills, and experiences gave her a unique advantage in union activism in Montreal. Used to walking the lines between immigrant and language communities, English, French, and Yiddish, Lea was able to advocate for union organization with thousands of underpaid and mistreated workers in Montreal's garment or schmata factories in the 1930s. Another clip from her archival collection describes some of these conditions.
Had I said,
nope.
Ich bin Kanadierin. Had I said, ich bin Kanadierin, aber ich bin auch Jüdin.
Sorry, there's the YWHA. I knew I didn't advance the slides correctly.
to the labor movement?
There we go.
Well, to the labor movement, they had no unions in here they had them in the States, but we didn't have our unions yet. And the Americans would come, they'd send in smart Alecs who didn't know their ass from their elbow, and they didn't care. They came here, we're going to organize this thing in 3 months. Bang, bang, bang. Signed cards, and that's it. And many of those little factories there, those in the Jacobs building, you should excuse me, with rats running around. Horrible, horrible. We used to go through the back stairs, and when the girls would go to the washroom in the back, we'd give them each one folder, one paper that we had put out, and say, put it in the toilet. The girls go, they'll find it. Oh, I don't want. T'as pas besoin d'avoir peur. On est là, on va te protéger. And we did. There was a need for a union. There was a need for a union. The bosses paid under the table there. If the girl was nice and had a nice little tussie, she'd get extra. She'd do things for the boss. But if she was there as a worker, they paid, they told her, c'est 6 piastres par semaine. And then it went up to, when they heard that there was a union, on va donner 7 piastres par semaine. Well, we were asking 11.
In 1937, Lea was part of the leadership, which also included organizers Rose Pizzota and Yvette Charpentier, which helped to organize the 5,000-strong walkout of the garment worker factories that lasted for 3 weeks. These photographs are actually not from Lea's collections, but I did want to make sure to include them. These are from the Bulkin family home at the Jewish Public Library, but this is an LGW strike. The strike was a major turning point for union organization in the city. It didn't achieve all of their aims, but it was a major turning point and did help to establish the International Ladies Garment Workers Union Local 262 of Montreal. And this is, again, it's a standalone collection within the JPL, but it's the only copy that I've ever been able to locate in any archive of something called The Organizer, which was published in 1937 by the ILGW, so just after it was formed. And you can see that Lea Roback is listed as the educational director and has a very thorough curriculum for the union employees. Lea obviously took education for these workers very seriously, and she knew what a difference it would make in people's lives. And so this is actually one of my favorite pieces from the entire collection. From 1941 to 1951, Lea worked for RCA Victor, successfully organizing a union in that factory. Between her work from the YWHA to the Modern Bookstore, which was Montreal's first Marxist bookstore, to the ILGW, and then the RCA Victor, Lea remained active in the Communist Party of Canada and within labor activism circles, as well as working with Thérèse Casgrain for women's suffrage in Quebec. Within her collection are speeches or scripts, which Ariela also mentioned as well, interacting with other labor leaders, discussing the future of labor in Canada, as well as the place of women in the workplace in post-war Canada. So the example I've provided here is from a script called Labor and the Future of Canada, 1941. And as Ariela did mention, there's pencil marks and marginalia all over these scripts where it's hard to tell because it's pencil too, of like when exactly Lea put those comments in there of someone adding something at the last minute, and it totally messed up the question as it should have been. So it would be so interesting as an archivist and as a historian to try and figure out when was she putting these comments in? Like, was this a reflection directly after this event or this radio talk, or was this 20 years later after reflection? So Ariela's novel brings Lea's story to this period of the late 50s, just up to 1958, when Lea Roback quit the Communist Party after the Hungarian Revolution, or because of the Hungarian Revolution. Her archives, of course, extend way beyond the period, documenting her involvement in anti-war, anti-nuclear weapon protests, her involvement in La Voix des Femmes, the fight for legal abortion in Canada, and protests in support of immigrant and Indigenous women within our country. Her archives stand in a place for a person who didn't work just for these issues, but she lived and breathed these issues. Working and researching in the Lea Roback collection is truly an inspirational experience. And like Ariela, because I didn't grow up in Montreal, I didn't have the experience of knowing who Lea was until I started working at the JPL Archives. And I totally get what you say when you say you felt like cheated, that you didn't know who this person was. And without a doubt, every single time I've had a student while I was at the JPL come in and start working in that collection, that is exactly their reaction. They're immediately drawn to her and her work and want to know more and want to know why other people don't know if they don't already. So it's a collection that continues to give no matter who it is that looks through it. I hope that's the end. That's all I have to say. But I hope with all my heart there are people out there that have never experienced the JPL before, and certainly JPL Archives, is that one day you'll have an excuse to walk through the doors and look through the remarkable collections that are there, most especially Lea's collection, obviously, but there's just so many treasures within there. So it's been a real pleasure to come back to my Jewish family roots, as it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. And you're always welcome back, as you know. At least. Janice actually had a question. The photos of the 1937 strike, which font are those photos from?
I cheated a little bit. They're actually from a strike in 1939 of the ILGWU, and they're from the Bulkin family font, which was a family that donated their archives in the mid-2000s. I don't remember the exact year, but there's a ton of stuff in there, yeah. The daughters wrote for the Montreal Star, and that's why they had the photograph.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat, but maybe I'll start a few questions, and maybe that'll kick up some other questions. And this is actually a question for both of you, because as somebody who's worked closely with Roback Shannon, and as somebody who has done an extensive array of research on Roback's life, Ariela. One of the things that struck me, and I was just telling Shannon and Ariela before we opened up the webinar, the book was delayed in actually arriving at the JPL, and I just finished it about 3 hours ago. I had ordered it back in January, just arrived 2 weeks ago. One of the things that struck me in her relationships with men who were also in the movement, people like Fred Rose and Bethune, there was an ambivalence. Because these are obviously men who were very much products of their times, who had obviously, I wouldn't necessarily say they were misogynistic, but there was certainly, their attitudes to women were very much of the time. And Lea was very much committed to an ideology that transcended any kind of injustice. And I'm wondering if, I guess this is a question for both of you, were both of you had this sort of awareness of this ambivalence that in the relationships that Lea had with men who were, sympathetic in terms of the political ideologies that they shared, but because of the divisions between male and female, I'm wondering if if that ever became apparent to you, in your research.
So Rose and Bethune are both characters in my book, and that was also kind of challenging to write because there's a great deal of work on both of them, and they are very famous figures. Bethune actually probably more than Rose, and more in other places even than he is in Canada. In China, school children learn a song about him because of his heroism coming over during the revolution. The way I imagine those characters in the book, and this came from what I'd read from her, I actually think she had very deep friendships with both of them. And I think that she had a way of managing, especially Bethune's womanizing, because he was a pretty notorious womanizer. And some of that I was able to kind of glean from what is available, and some of that had to do with what I imagined. But she writes about both of them with tremendous warmth and gratitude. She doesn't particularly pick out the ways in which they fell short for her. If anything, I think she called them out on that a little bit less maybe than she might have. In other cases, like Bernard Shain, she's very explicitly critical of him. And that's complicated as well, because he ended up playing a really important role bringing a lot of Jewish refugees over to Canada right after 1945. Like in some narratives, he is a hero. He was not a hero to her. She did not have a lot of patience for him. But Bethune and Rose, she admired both of them very much.
Within the collection too, there is a selection of letters to Fred Rose and his wife. And after they had to leave Canada, she did maintain a friendship with them. So I think that in itself speaks to it, to her feelings for them. My impression of going through Lea's collection is always that there were things that were black and white to her that were wrong or right, but there was also a lot of understanding of gray areas in people's morals or their personalities. I don't think she would judge sex workers for what they had to do. She wouldn't judge women in their home for what they had to do. And so, you know, that ambivalence or those gray areas that existed within people, I think she was just very attuned to seeing people as complex humans, which, you know, in itself is a special trait in a person, especially someone working in what would be a very challenging and somewhat frightful, scary place.
You know, I think for herself, not choosing marriage and not choosing children allowed her an enormous amount of freedom. So she had latitude in her life that was not available, you know, to her mother and to her mother's generation, and even to many, many of the women who she grew up alongside. And that was a bold choice, and it was a deliberate choice, and it was a choice for autonomy for her.
Thank you. There's a question. Do either of you know what relationship Lea would have had, if any, with Madeleine Parent?
Yeah, so because my book ends in 1945, I don't get to write much about Madeleine Parent. I actually have a tiny cameo where she meets her at McGill when Parent is still a student, which is when they first met. But their involvement was largely subsequent to the time in my novel. Lea was a huge inspiration to Madeleine Parent, and then Madeleine Parent went on to win many impactful victories in the labor movement. So they were friends, they were collaborators, they inspired one another. They had a long and deep relationship. Entretien avec Lea Roback and Madeleine Parent, which I'd mentioned earlier, is two very long interviews, and one is with Roback and one is with Parent, and it's really worth reading, and they talk about each other in it. So if you're interested in that relationship, that's one place to go, Nicole Lasselle's book.
And also, if people are interested in archival research on Madeleine Parent, her collection exists at the McGill University Archives.
There's a question from Lena Harper. I think the question, what is the title of your book? It's called Lea, a Novel. That's basically it. Simple to remember. I actually had a question for you, Ariela. This was, actually, I'm going to read the passage if just beg your indulgence just for a minute. This has to do with the fact that Lea was fluent in a number of languages. I'm reading from page 89. Like her uncle, she is good at languages. From French, Italian feels, I guess she's in Rome at this time. From French, Italian feels reachable, though sometimes she thinks she knows a word and finds it means something very different. In a language class in Grenoble, the teacher had talked about a new concept in linguistics called false friends, words that sound alike in different languages but signal differently. So often you think you have encountered something familiar only to find yourself mistaken. Worse than the opacity of ignorance is the unwitting blindness of false recognition. The traveler makes false friends wherever she goes. I thought this was really brilliant, and it reminded me, I guess this is more a comment than a question, but in some of the rare book workshops that I run, I talk about Martin Luther's translation of the Bible into German, which caused basically a paradigm shift in early modern history, or at least earlier than that. And one of the things that I read about him is that he spoke a dialect. I think he was from southern Germany, but because his family traveled so often, and because Germany was so segmented at the time, he actually learned the dialects of all of the regions of Germany where his parents traveled. And it was in that way that he was able to translate the Bible into a German that all of these various regions in Germany could understand. So it was almost as though he was unifying one language, even though they were quite distinct at the time, or not quite distinct, but different enough that I guess was the case in Italy, where you still have extreme regional dialects. And it just occurred to me that one of the measures of her success was precisely her ability not just to speak, French, Yiddish, English, German, but she was able to use the kind of street language that spoke very directly to the people, and that makes the world a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing to hear her speaking, because she's kind of obscene sometimes in ways that can be surprising, and very vernacular and incredibly lively. So the sort of fluidity that she had, it wasn't just that she had a gift for languages, because clearly she did, and clearly that was a family gift. She also had an ability to meet people where they were at. And she was tremendously cultured. Like, she had this literary background, and she read a lot, and she went to the theater all the time. And she was able to participate in a conversation that was very sophisticated, but she was also able to participate in a conversation that was funny, that was obscene, that was earthy. She had all these different registers, and she didn't seem inauthentic in any of them. She just seemed like somebody who loved to talk with different people where they were at, which is an incredible gift.
And obviously would have been vital to the success that she had within factories, working with girls from different backgrounds, and then, women from different backgrounds, and then moving into negotiations as well. And she just did, her ability to move through spheres within life was just amazing.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, Shannon, in particular, and it's funny, we worked together for many years, and I don't think we ever really had a chance to talk objectively about the collection that you were overseeing. So it feels a little bit strange doing this now that you've been gone for a few years. I'm hoping I can remember my question by the time I actually end this very long introduction. In what way do you think, I know that the archives are diverse, but in what way do you think Lea's font is representative of the archives as a whole? We very much tout the fact that we have the archives of the progressive, social, radical figures of Jewish intellectuals from the turn of the 20th century. Do you feel in any way that that her font is representative of the archives as a whole?
So I'm going to answer that by reading out Norma Joseph's comment. She said, "There's a great ambivalence in the educational world teaching about women activists. There's an ambivalence in the Jewish world today celebrating a female union activist. There's an ambivalence in the Western world accepting the contributions of a Jewish communist." So the reason that struck me, aside from the fact that it's from Norma, so hello Norma, is that the one thing that's always stuck with me about Lea's collection is that at one point we had 3 lovely archival technician students from Collège Lionel Gros, the irony of the name of that cégep being active in the Jewish Public Library, not lost on me. And their supervisor, their professor, came to check up on them and see what they were doing. And they were working with Lea's collection, and he started to argue with me, not unfriendly, but he was trying to tell me that I was wrong, that Lea Roback was not Jewish. He had heard of her. She is well known within the French labor community, but he was convinced that she wasn't Jewish. So first of all, please don't argue with me. You're standing in the Jewish Public Library, literally looking at her boxes. But why was that such a stretch for him to believe? Why was that such a weird concept for him, that there was a third solitude out there of people who contributed immensely to the social fabric of Quebec? And so I think, you know, if we're talking about the representativeness of Lea's collection, is that she moved through all these worlds, as we were just talking about. She could communicate with whoever was in front of her in multiple languages, but also just on a, you know, on a human basis, she was able to emote with people that were in front of her. But why is it that there's all these people within the Jewish Public Library's collections that contributed not just within the Jewish community, but also to Montreal society and Quebec society? And, you know, they're representative because they did all of this. They went about their lives, and they need to be recognized more. So I think, I'm not sure if I'm actually answering the question, but I think just that the collections within the archives are so rich, they're so diverse, and there's so much more that can be done with them in terms of community engagement outside of the Jewish community with the French and English communities as well.
That answers the question. Now I'm thinking of Hirsch Harshman. I'm thinking of so many people who are so well represented in the archives. I actually have I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, like, the literary archives too, it's only been relatively recent and really not as much as it could be, where Yiddish poets of Montreal have been given more profile within, I would say more so in the French community because of Pierre Antil's translations of many of their works. But there's the Yiddish literary canon that exists within Montreal is amazing and should be put up more within, and you know, all of those things exist within the Jewish Public Library archives as well. So
I don't see any questions in the chat. A lot of comments. It seems like we've also kicked up a family reunion of Robacks in the chat, which is lovely. I'm very happy we're able to do that. Just reading the last one, it's a privilege to have so many members of the, well, that was from you, Ariel. It's a letter where she writes a Roback is a Roback wherever they go. Yeah, it seems that way. I think there's a niece out in rural BC who's going to want, I don't think she was able to connect because I don't think they have internet. They were trying to listen in, couldn't get the telephone, the access number, but I'll take care of that after. Well, if there are no other questions, I mean, we could go on for another few hours, but I have a sense that had Lea been with us this afternoon, she would have just left early in order to organize a rally of disenfranchised immigrants somewhere. So maybe we'll just end it here. On behalf of the Jewish Public Library, Ariela, thank you very much for sharing your novel and the work that went on behind its conception and creation. As Rivka Augenfeld told me when we came up with this event, idea combining fact and fiction, we sometimes forget that as an institution that was built by people, the library is more than brick, mortar, and glass. It's also the consolidation and convergence of stories that make make an institutional saga. And Léa Roback is part of this ongoing narrative. So thank you very much for writing this novel, which it's such an interesting way of reading history. And it's one of the ways in which we're trying to develop more programs that try and teach history in ways that are entertaining and histories that are memorable. Shannon, our thanks go out to you, not just because you've given up part of your Sunday to be back with us, but also because back in 2005, you laid down some groundwork in recreating the JPL archives that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise, and which has enabled us to demonstrate just how vital the JPL archives have become in the collective mind of the populations it serves. So thank you. My thanks also go out to the current staff of the JPL archives and JPL special collections that now comprise 6 people. Shannon and I used to do the work of 6 people, but thanks to the Israeli Foundation and our current director of archives, Maya Pasternak, who's now on short-term leave, we can promise you a number of extraordinary programs that will be happening here over the next few years, as early as this autumn. I'm going to just plug in a virtual event happening on June 26th for those of you who are interested, as part of the Dr. Michael Paul Rare Books Initiative collaboration we're doing with the Center for Jewish Art in Jerusalem, entitled A Book, a Manuscript, and an Object, the Life of Jewish Texts on Both Sides of the Glass. It promises to be exceptional because, amongst other things, it will include artifacts from the Gross family collection, sampling some of the thousands of examples of Jewish material culture in countries from across the diaspora. Finally, thanks very much to all of you for being here this afternoon and, by virtue of your presence, lending support to the Jewish Public Library. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.